there, and welcome to Season 15, Episode 32 of the Bitcoin Takeover podcast. I am Vlad, and my guest today is Aaron Day, a man who has been a Bitcoiner since 2012. He has been living off Bitcoin, gold, and silver, and probably other coins too, since 2019. He had a short stunt to run for president and was not successful to get elected during the primary elections. And he also published a very interesting book that I put in the description, and you should be able to check it out. It's basically called The Final Countdown, and it's about CBDCs and the fact that at this point, it's not a matter of whether or not they're going to come, it's a matter of when they're going to come. So welcome, Aaron. It's good to have you, and let's talk about some of these topics.
Awesome. Thank you for having me on.
You also have a podcast, Aaron. You should mention it early on so people can know where they can check that out.
Sure. I do have a podcast called the Aaron Day Show, where we've just finished our third episode. The whole purpose of it is basically building off of the concepts in my book, which doesn't show up too well on the green screen, but it's called The Final Countdown. And this book is all about the threat of central bank digital currencies, how close central bank digital currencies are to broad adoption, and the inevitable failure of fiat currencies. And then the last half of the book goes into practical advice for how people can move into crypto, gold, and silver. And so the podcast is basically interviews that go into more in-depth on the topics of the book itself. So for instance, last week I interviewed Roger Ver about his book, Hijacking Bitcoin. So that podcast is available on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, Rumble, and X, and YouTube.
Okay, so let's start with this. What is a central bank digital currency? How do you define that?
I define a central bank digital currency as a digital form of fiat currency, essentially, that can be programmed, monitored, and censored by a government or financial institution like central bank or banking partner. It's basically the gateway to social credit systems, digital IDs, vaccine passports. It's basically, to me, like the central point for complete digital tyranny. And by the way, that's what it actually is. The way people describe it, when you hear the positive aspects of it, they'll say that, oh, it's all about convenience and financial inclusion. But the reality is every implementation so far has been more about surveillance and control and less about those other attributes.
Well, I did hear about some pilot projects here in Europe that are trying to bring a digital euro, and they do plan to have some sort of privacy within certain limits. And it's going to function basically like one of these Chaumian mints, where for larger amounts, you're going to have to identify the transaction. But for small spendings, it's fine. You don't have to tell people who you are. But I think the question that we should be asking right now is, how is this CBDC different from the banking system that we already have? Because at this point, most of Western citizens make their payments with their credit cards, and they do reveal a lot of information. And they contribute every day to this state of surveillance capitalism, where there's a lot of data that gets collected about everyone and gets shared and sold across multiple parties. So how would a CBDC be much better or much worse?
Well, I think that the first part of it is fiat currency. The current system is bad already. People should be exiting the system as it is for the reasons that you just described. I mean, I like to say that the money that you have in your bank account does not belong to you. If you ever want to, if you're really into fear porn, just read the terms and conditions of your bank account. They literally can cancel your bank account at any time. I actually just shared two videos yesterday, one from the Royal Bank of Canada showing somebody who was unable to take $3,000 out of the bank to buy a car. They literally wouldn't let him without signing paperwork and going through an entire process. There was a news segment yesterday out of Australia about a woman who went into her bank to take out cash, and they actually said they don't even have physical cash anymore. So she was required to actually move her money from one bank to another bank in order to be able to withdraw cash. So the first point of this is the existing system is already bad, and it's getting worse, particularly in the US. If you look at starting with the Patriot Act, and then you have the Bank Secrecy Act, and then you have other things, enhanced KYC, know your customer, or anti-money laundering laws. It is getting more difficult to use the existing banking system today. ATMs are shutting down. The limits as to how much you can withdraw are becoming narrower and narrower. It's becoming difficult to set up a bank account, depending upon what kind of business that you're in. If you're selling firearms, if you are selling in a marijuana related business that may or may not, it may even be legal in your state, if you are doing things related to crypto, if you have certain religious organizations, you are already being kind of discriminated against and flagged by the existing banking system. I mean, we've seen this with anywhere from Kanye West, where Chase Bank basically froze $100 million of his assets and money and wouldn't let him move it, to Dr. Joseph Mercola, who is a big proponent of alternative health and has spoken out against vaccines. He's had his bank accounts and his company bank accounts shut down. So my first point to this is the existing system is already bad. People should exit it anyway, even if CBDCs weren't coming. CBDCs just add an extra level of surveillance and make it that much easier for your money to be shut off or to be tied into a social credit system. So I think a lot of this is going to be about social engineering with respect to how the money can be programmed. So for instance, if the economy isn't doing well and the government decides, well, we need to stimulate the economy, they can implement, and this has been drafted. I've seen or heard about this in Europe, where kind of like what Cyprus did in 2008. If they'll just take your money. I mean, they'll come and say, if you don't actually spend your CBDC, we're going to remove it from your account. If you're familiar with health savings accounts, particularly in the United States, you can actually set aside money that will go on a debit card that can be used on a kind of a tax-free basis, but it can only be used to purchase items that are on a pre-approved list, that are pre-approved by a centralized group of people to be legitimate healthcare expenses. Well, CBDCs are essentially could be like that, except for every purchase, where literally if it's not on a white list, you can't purchase it at all. So literally it's complete control over what you can buy, what you can sell, when you can buy and when you can sell. And then furthermore, how that's tied to your behavior as dictated by third parties. So it just gives them more granular control and restricts personal choice. So it's a worse form of fiat, but fiat's already bad.
I listened to your example from Cyprus, and it did remind me actually that maybe that this is new to the United States. You haven't had such an event, but I can think of my grandfather who had a workshop here in Romania. And basically, when the communist regime came along and they took all the property and gave it to the state and then said it belongs to all the people, which is an interesting way of framing it, they also changed the money. So everyone who had savings, and some people actually had truckloads of money, of cash, was supposed to change just a limited amount that they were allowed to change into the new currency. And the old currency was no longer being accepted. And I'm pretty sure that there are lots of such examples around the world that happened over the centuries, where the money changed overnight. And if you had the old form of money, there was no way for you to spend it, even though in a system where coins are made of precious metals, there is no way that any merchant can actually deny or refuse a transaction. You can just melt the coin and reshape it, put it in another shape or form, and give it to someone else in exchange for good or services. But this is a paper money. This is a fiat issue that I guess is going to become more common around the world. If, maybe not if, but when the system collapses and there's too much inflation and they come up with the solution that saves everything. But the way in which you frame CBDCs, it seems to me like you are nationalizing stuff that's already private. I'm pretty sure that banks already give you a score. I'm pretty sure that banks can already restrict the ways in which you spend your money. The reason why they don't do it too much is that they're competing with other banks, and they know that if customers are not happy with the service and they want to do something else, they're gonna go to a competing bank. But when you're dealing with a government, it's much harder to exit. It's more difficult to opt out because it's a monopoly on violence. It's a monopoly on issuance of official money, which is fiat money, but still it's the official form of money. And CBDCs are undergoing this process of nationalizing what used to be private.
It is nationalizing what used to be private, and there is a movement towards more centralization, moving towards kind of a one world government approach. The IMF has actually already started working on developing a global CBDC. If you actually look at the UN Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, they're basically trying to regulate everything on a global basis, from the air to the water to the air to the land to the sea to where you can work, how you can work, with a real big emphasis actually on your carbon score, creating kind of my belief is that if left unchecked, we'd be looking at a global CBDC that's backed by carbon credits. And so that's something that, usually when you say stuff like that, it's like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory. It's really not a conspiracy theory. You can actually look at the documents and look at the meetings and the minutes of what's going on with groups like the UN. You can look at the WEF, the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, and the World Bank. These groups are working together. In fact, they develop toolkits and have conferences with one another, trying to help define the framework for CBDCs. And the UN has even said CBDCs are going to be a critical component of the rollout of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So I think that not only is it's going from private to national, but I think that there's increasingly a consolidation from national to global.
That's a valid point, even though when we speak about international community and the global government, we're mostly speaking about Western countries agreeing with each other, because I don't see China or Russia or India and basically the BRICS countries. They're trying to form their own rules and create their own organization that's very much like the UN or the European Union. And it's interesting to see this balance of power. It might lead to a new Cold War. It might lead to competition between countries if we're positive and we believe we're gonna live peaceful times. There will be more options for you to opt out with different trade-offs. And maybe that governments are gonna become like restaurants where you see what's on the menu, you see how much it costs, and you decide where you want to stay. But it's definitely interesting because the conversation about CBDCs, even though it's being had at a national level in the West and within these international organizations, which are also led by Western countries, it's also present in China, it's also present in Russia, it's present in all of these places where they realize that control over capital can make them more quote unquote efficient because it's easier for them to collect taxes. They can control the supply and the demand of their currency. And there's a lot more that they can do, which is tyrannical.
There is, and while we do have the BRICS, I mean, certainly, you know, I wonder how much of this is even manufactured, because the United States works awfully closely with China. It's kind of like, even you look at COVID, it's like, if China's our mortal enemy, then why did the United States spend 2 years developing bioweapons with China? Like that doesn't make a lot of sense. And when you dig into the social credit system that has been implemented in China looks very similar to, and I did this in a little bit in my book. If you took the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, and you tried to translate that into a social credit system, if you said, well, based on what their goals are, what behavior would I reward, what behavior would I punish in a social credit system, it looks a lot like what is already implemented in China. So, and when you delve into it a little bit more, the social credit system in China, they will measure, they have such a robust, I guess, surveillance and AI system that they can track not only all human movement, but even down to the point where they know what you bought in a store and then what you maybe put in your cart and didn't buy. And this system will punish down to the level of if you cheated in a video game or you didn't visit your elderly parents enough. There are already 23 million people in China that are blacklisted based on their social credit score. And if you're blacklisted, that means you have restricted access to travel, healthcare, education. But what's interesting is the United States and most of the world gets its AI surveillance technology, half of it from China. And that's one of the things when I go around and I give these 4-hour workshops based on my book, and I teach people about what's going on across the world. And, when I explain what's going on in China and show what the Chinese system looks like, everybody's like, well, that will never happen in America. And if you read any of Edward Snowden's books or what he's been warning us about, or the fact that I think this Thursday, they're going to vote to continue to basically violate Americans' Fourth Amendment rights. And they're going to basically give the NSA complete power over the internet and basically enable businesses to serve as kind of spies for the NSA. We already have the surveillance structure to a large extent that China has. In the US, our pictures are taken 75 to 80 times a day by surveillance cameras above and beyond whatever pictures we take of ourselves and put online. There are 100,000 surveillance cameras installed in the United States every day. So yeah, maybe the BRICS is going to be opposition, and maybe at the end of it we end up with competition, or maybe it's manufactured competition, and at the end there's just a move behind the scenes to implement a more totalitarian surveillance state. I don't know the answer to that. But when I see things on the CBDC pilot side, for instance, in the US, there have been 3 CBDC pilots. First is called Project Hamilton, which is basically a replacement for cash, a replacement for what we use for day-to-day purchases. And this pilot was between the MIT Multimedia Lab and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. And they've already developed a technology. It can do 1.8 million transactions per second. So when we have a lot of these conversations in crypto, and there's like the big Bitcoin debate, 7 transactions per second or whatever, understand they've already built a retail CBDC that does 1.8 million transactions per second. And there's actually overlap in some of the developers that worked on Bitcoin Core and worked on the Project Hamilton white paper. In fact, Corey Fields is a Bitcoin Core developer who's actually on the Project Hamilton white paper. So at the conclusion of the pilot that they did from 2020 to 2022, they said, we have the technology, we just need to figure out the legality and the marketing. So most Americans or people in general across the world have no idea that the pilot has already gone to that level of sophistication. There's another pilot called Project Cedar, which is for wholesale transactions for banks to basically send value across the border. And then there's this thing called Regulated Liability Network, which is probably the most dystopian of all 3 of the CBDC pilots. And this is basically one ledger that will track all CBDC transactions and all digital assets. And so it's basically, imagine a situation in the future where you're required to register your digital assets. And everybody's now talking about real world assets and tokens. And I'll give you an example. For security tokens, the idea is instead of trading stocks the way we trade stocks today, there will be a digital token, which will be on this regulated liability network. And that digital token will be able to be tracked and monitored by DTCC, which is this third party that already issues all of the stock certificates for publicly traded companies. The Fed will be able to see it, and everything will settle in CBDC. So they're building infrastructure, and I encourage people to look up Regulated Liability Network because it's far worse than just digital currency. It's the digitization of all assets, but where all digital assets can be monitored, tracked, and programmed, and then settled in CBDC. So the way I look at this is there are 2 kind of sides to crypto. I mean, I got into crypto and into Bitcoin in 2012, and I saw immediately that, hey, this is a way for me to engage in commerce without any banks or any third parties. And, at the time it was instant and there were basically no transaction costs for Bitcoin. And so that's kind of the pro-freedom side to this. But because of all of the infighting and the hijacking and everything else, since 2012, central banks looked at Bitcoin and governments looked at Bitcoin and said, hey, this is a threat. So they have done everything possible to try to regulate digital assets while at the same time building the opposite side, the tyrannical side of digital currencies, which are these forms that are completely programmable, that are not permissionless, and that are controlled by one or more third parties. And so we're really dealing with kind of this battle between freedom and tyranny within this digital space. And that applies to currency as well as the tokenization of real world assets and all assets. And it's frightening to see how far the other side, the tyrannical side, is progressing, because we keep on going through these cycles where everybody's like, oh, how much money am I going to make? And here's an altcoin, and here's a, first it was ICOs, and now it's literally just meme coins, and everybody's like, what's this cycle going to be like? And so while we're working on these cycles and looking at this as something that just oscillates up and down in a boom bust manner, and most people are looking at it as a way to maximize the amount of fiat they can get, the people on the other side have looked at this technology and said, how can we actually build on this and scale it for control and for surveillance purposes? And so it's frightening to see, because I think it's a more urgent situation than people think. It's usually when I talk to people in crypto, they're worried about, oh, it's this crypto versus this crypto, and not looking at, well, what is the traditional financial system doing? And what are central banks and governments doing? And I think if people put more focus on that, there would probably be more urgency for adopting the use of cryptocurrency for use in a parallel economy, so that we don't all get trapped and stuck in this kind of CBDC nightmare tyranny situation.
Yeah, it's pretty funny that the people who said they were in this for the technology turned out to be feds. I'm joking right now, of course not. There are a lot of good actors who are working on interesting stuff and have good intentions. But I think you foreshadowed a bit of my question. I was going to ask you, where does Bitcoin fall into place with this CBDC environment? How do you see it?
I mean, I see it like, I lived through the hijacking as well. I mean, I used Bitcoin like in my day-to-day life. I actually did some political activism. In 2014, I had a super PAC and raised money, raised Bitcoin, and actually paid activists in Bitcoin. And so then in 2017, I remember when you could use Bitcoin directly at Expedia and at overstock.com and Steam and everything. And then all of a sudden, people weren't using it for day-to-day transactions anymore. And then this narrative shifted. And so all of a sudden if you were sitting there in 2012, nobody was sitting around in 2012 that was in Bitcoin saying, oh, we're not going to use this to buy and sell things. This is just going to be digital gold. Nobody was sitting there saying the whole purpose of this is, how can I get this and then not use it? That was certainly not the ethos in 2012. And so then all of a sudden this narrative shift happened. I think Roger's book is interesting. I think there are other aspects of this that need to be explored further, because it used to be that you had this Bitcoin Foundation that was a community-based organization that was funding development work. It imploded, and then MIT took over. And interestingly, this guy, Joy Ito, who was the chair of the MIT Multimedia Lab, he also co-founded something called Digital Garage, which is a venture capital firm that had invested in a bunch of cryptos. So he funded SegWit, he funded Lightning, and the MIT group funded all three of the US CBDC pilots. So for me, I'm very interested in learning a little bit more about how this narrative shift happened from digital cash to digital gold. I think the digital gold argument is ridiculous. And I don't see how this enables freedom in any way. I think BTC has become the opposite of what it was supposed to be. And now you have people cheering on Roger talks about the hijacking of BTC. I think it's the hijacking of Austrian economics. I think that what's going on here is completely antithetical to what it's supposed to be. And so now you have all of these people trying to acquire this, and then the biggest area of new interest for BTC is through these, WEF partner companies like BlackRock or Fidelity, where you're going through one third party like BlackRock, who is then storing the BTC at another third party like Coinbase. We've now gone from peer to peer to there being two intermediaries, between the end consumer and actual Bitcoin. And so like the narrative makes absolutely no sense. And I think it's even shifted to the point where people think, well, we're going to hold it. It's going to be digital gold, and then going to use it to back their fiat currencies, which is so when I look at Bitcoin, they're kind of like they're in three flavors of it. And I know there are more. I think the BTC people now have gone from peer-to-peer cash to its digital gold, and that this digital gold is going to back is going to be the backing for central bank digital currencies. BCH has remained consistent with the idea of this is peer-to-peer cash that people use for daily transactions, and BSV has adopted this approach that there's only going to be one chain. Our chain is so technically superior that everybody is going to have to use it, and all CBDCs are going to run on top of BSV. So that's how this landscape has shaken out. I think that the idea that central banks are in this for because they're interested in transparency and that they're interested in permissionless is out of line with the history of central banking. Central banks do not have positive intent. Like they're in it to. They have created and fomented wars. Like there's no end to what bankers have demonstrated their willingness to do to generate more income. So this idea that central banks are in it for the tech, they're not. They're in it for the control and they're in it for the money. And so I find that I don't know how like people that were originally involved in Bitcoin can, and most, by the way, people that I know from 2012 are not Bitcoin maximalists. The majority of people that I know have actually softened off of that position. They may still hold a lot of BTC, but I don't know how somebody that was involved in 2010, 2011 could possibly sell themselves on how this narrative has shifted. It's baffling to me.
Well, some people like to make fiat money, and that's it. But at the same time, I want to challenge you on this view. I didn't do this with Roger because he gave me limited time, and I wanted to discuss other topics. But how can Bitcoin be hijacked when it's just a protocol? It's an idea. And basically, what happened in 2017 was that the community split. There was the people who did not want to increase the block size under the terms of the New York Agreement, and they stuck with BTC. And then you had BCH, and there was also a plan for SegWit 2x, which was coming later in the year, but ultimately it failed and they all joined BCH. And BCH was basically a bet on scaling on chain and using Bitcoin as digital cash as opposed to digital gold. And I think it's very good that we had these two competing versions and we saw what the market demands for. And it seems like in inflationary times, people cared much more about saving with Bitcoin as opposed to spending Bitcoin all the time. And to this argument, I also want to add that something like BSV, which has very large blocks and is centralized by virtue of single entities that validate the chain and miners that are friendly with this concept, that's the ultimate CBDC because Bitcoin in design is an open ledger. And if you only have a few validators and you also require some compliance, you're gonna turn that beautiful technology which was created to liberate us into something that's used for surveillance at a large scale.
Well, on the BSV front, I think that's exactly what's happened, and that was frustrating for me because I started using BSV, and I know a lot of the people in the community, and I had even spoken with Craig Wright because at some point a year or so ago, his narrative started to shift. BSV wasn't always this pro CBDC thing, and then all of a sudden, nChain put up a section on their website, and now they filed some patents, and now all of a sudden BSV is going to be this chain. And I tried to engage Craig on this, and I'm like, look, central banks are not going to adopt your chain. I know you think that there's some Trojan horse here where everybody's going to have to use your thing, but you like, and his response to me was, well, I don't need to hear anything that you have to say on CBDCs. I'm getting a PhD on CBDCs. This is essentially what his response. His response to me was, I'm not thinking big enough, but he's not going to entertain what I have to say because he's getting a PhD on it. And if you look at Now, the centralization of mining at BSV, I think, is a function of the fact that Craig and Enchain and others have used lawfare and patent trolling. There's the mining could become decentralized overnight if people actually believed in the technology and didn't think they were going to wind up in lawsuits, right? That dynamic can change. It is completely centralized now. Over 50% of the hash rate is controlled by Calvin Ayre, who also has the majority of control over Enchain, which controls the entire patent portfolio. And Craig has sued everybody, and so including many of the exchanges. So no wonder no one can buy BSV because none of the exchanges list it, and none in the U.S. It's actually hard to get. There are 250 confirmations. And then they've implemented these agreements, these legal agreements, where if you're mining, it's kind of like you have to sign up to a terms of service, and that now the transactions can be frozen. And so, yeah, they've butchered the concept, and now they've added legal layers on top of it, which is unfortunate because the ability to do a lot of transactions per second in scale could actually work, but it can't work under the way that they've rolled this thing out. I think there are questions as to, is it an idea? I mean, I think Bitcoin was designed to be, clearly was designed to be an economic system. And if you read the white paper, if you read Bitcoin Talk, and in particular, if you read the Malmi emails that came out of the Copa versus Craig Wright trial between Malmi and Satoshi, I mean, it's very clear that there was originally not supposed to be a block size in Bitcoin at all. There was no block size limit. It was put in there intentionally, kind of when you're testing things at a very early stage because of some complications that might arise. But from very early on, Satoshi said this was intended to compete with Visa and MasterCard on chain. And the entire way that the system was set up in terms of the mining rewards and having a halving every 4 years was designed to provide incentives for people to mine and provide security for the network until such time as transactions started to scale, and until such time as the network was able to compete with Visa and MasterCard, at which point miners would make money by processing large numbers of transactions. And so now somehow we've gone from that to this manufactured scarcity argument where things are capped at 1 megabyte, which was something that was put in arbitrarily for a test period 15 years ago. And now people are trying to rationalize some notion of decentralization, even though if you look at hard drive costs and capacity, bandwidth costs and capacity, RAM, everything else, like it's ridiculous to hold the network hostage at this earlier rate. And so now we have this system where essentially the idea is the L1 can only do 7 transactions per second, and it's secure because people using 15-year-old equipment who don't actually add transactions to the ledger, but who observe, are the ones keeping it secure. It's actually a completely ridiculous argument. And so over time, it becomes now more and more expensive. So this network is secured by people that don't have an economic interest using inferior equipment, essentially watching central banks move large amounts of value back and forth to one another. It actually doesn't make a lot of sense. As to why did the market speak, there are a lot of like propaganda statements out there. It's like, well, it's just code, or it's just open source, as if people are developing code for free and other people are coming in and auditing code, open source code for free with no compensation and no motivation. Like somehow there's this underlying spirit that people are acting altruistically to develop and monitor code with no ulterior motive. And clearly, when you look at the history of Bitcoin, that is not the case. There's always somebody funding developers, whether it was the Bitcoin Foundation or then it became MIT Multimedia Lab, or now it's Blockstream funding these developers. Yeah, it might be open source, but somebody's funding it. Well, why are those people funding it? What is their motivation for funding it? Replaced by fee, for example, which everybody at the time, including Adam Back, was against, seems to have been funded by this guy, the shadowy character, John Dillon, who has ties to the intelligence community and was interested in hobbling the idea of peer-to-peer cash. Blockstream sells for-profit L2 solutions that scale to make up for the manufactured slowness and high cost of the L1. So I think what Roger would argue is, at the time, some of the tactics used, and I think if people were made aware of what tactics were used in terms of everything from denial of service attacks to propaganda to censorship to basically block big blocks, it's not clear how many people in the marketplace actually even understood what was going on. And so now, because of what was going on at a finite period of time in 2017, people are now stuck with this, idea that it's digital gold and that this somehow was always what it was supposed to be. And I go around the country. So what's interesting about this, because if we're on crypto Twitter, a lot of the people that we talk to every day are like, oh, this battle's been won and fought and the market's already decided. I went to 20 states and I give this talk on my book, and a lot of these people are new to crypto. There are a lot of actual boomers, people that actually have, like, 43% of the wealth in the US is held by boomers. And if you ask boomers, they don't know anything about any of what we're talking about, block size wars or anything else. In fact, I do these surveys when I go through it, and I do each section of the presentation. And I ask, more people have heard of Sam Bankman-Fried than have heard of Satoshi Nakamoto. Most people outside of our bubble aren't even aware of the fact that you can use cryptocurrency for day-to-day transactions. They're not aware that that was ever a use case. Their entire perception of this has been molded by what they've seen in the mainstream media and what they've heard. And that it's usually whatever this digital gold narrative is. They're even unfamiliar with certainly any of the level of the detail of stuff that Roger spoke about with his book. So I'm more interested in, I'm largely talking day to day to people that are outside of crypto. And these are people that are now, because of what happened with COVID policies, that are awake for the first time. They've seen the lockdowns and the mandates, and they've experienced inflation. These are people that were maybe not asking, well, what is the Federal Reserve? How does fiat currency work? Like, people are waking up, and those people that are waking up are not familiar with any of the discussions or any of the inside battles that happened within Bitcoin in 2017. They know nothing about it. And so when you talk to those people about, BlackRock ETFs, and you talk to them about, what do you think about the fact that the same group that funded changes in Bitcoin to change it from digital cash to digital gold also funded the 3 CBDC pilots? What do you think about the fact that Epstein provided funding to that group, and also to the group that funded Blockstream and others? People have a different perspective of it now. And when you look at it and you kind of zoom out, it's what happened in 2017 upon reflection may not have been the right thing. And people being empowered with knowledge might make different conclusions today. So, and there's other stuff. I'm interviewing this guy, Steven Narioff, this week. I don't know if you've followed the ETH situation much, but basically he claims he was basically a founder of Ethereum. He did create the first legal documentation for a utility token. He created the first legal documentation for a security token, which was T0, which actually Overstock, the company, did a $10 million bond sale like years and years ago using a security token. And so this guy Narioff was the lawyer who drafted that. And he exposed some of the corruption going on with Ethereum and their crowdfunding. And his claim was that basically the DOJ came in, manufactured a extortion charge against him, told him he would never see his kids again, threw him in a van, like handcuffed him, and told him he'd never see his kids again, and basically tried to use this extortion case to get him to rat out people in the pro-liberty crypto space, including and this is what I'm going to interview and talk to him about. I know I've heard Patrick Byrne and Naomi Brockwell are two names that have been listed, and I can suspect that other people. I wouldn't be surprised to hear that Roger and Eric Voorhees and others are on this, because I think going all the way back to 2017, there has been a concentrated effort to kill cryptocurrency as peer-to-peer commerce for the specific purpose of bringing in CBDCs. So I think that what happened around 2017 is actually tied into CBDCs. I think that this is all actually related. So, but there's what Rogers put in his book, which I think is very factually based. Some of the stuff that I'm talking about, it's true MIT funded this stuff, and I think that Stephen Nerioff has some more components to this. But I think that we're close to, over the next few months, realizing just how big of a crackdown, using legal means, using propaganda, using various methods, there has been to stop peer-to-peer digital cash from taking hold, because it's a threat to central banks and it's a threat to governments.
Okay, you said a lot of stuff, and I have a lot to unpack right now. But let me start with this. You appealed to the authority of Satoshi Nakamoto and said that he mentioned some ideas in his emails, but you have to remember that he used cryptography from the early 2000s and put together something which was largely unfinished. If you look at version 0.1 of the code, it came with a broken game of poker and an unfinished P2P marketplace that he probably envisioned as a use case for this invention. Both of these were removed from the code base eventually, and they were turned into maybe applications that other people built as businesses. And there's a lot that Satoshi did not mention in the white paper. He did not mention the 21 million cap, which appears to be sacred across all forks of Bitcoin. Not even BSV lifted that, they seem to be sticking with it. The white paper has some naive assumptions about privacy, and this is the point that I'm going to use to pivot around this conversation. Because maybe that in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, it made sense to spend Bitcoin on chain. But after this, I think since the launch of the first blockchain observing services like blockchain.com, we've had this burgeoning field of blockchain analysis, and it became easier than ever to observe transactions and see where they go and create algorithms that look for patterns. And I think right now Bitcoin is sort of a panopticon in the sense that all ways to on-ramp and off-ramp are regulated, and in the US at least you have to KYC with all of them. So there isn't much privacy with this. It makes no sense to use it for commerce because it can be the CBDC. If you make it scale with large blocks, so if you use only the base layer for scalability, you're only going to make it easier for third parties and governments to track your transactions. That's why I mentioned earlier that BSV is the perfect CBDC, because it's centralized, it can be hijacked by governments, and it's very easy to observe what's happening on the blockchain. So if you only have a limited number of on-ramps and off-ramps and they're all KYC'd, the only way in which you can get into the system is if you accept payments for your goods and services in this currency. But at one point you're gonna sell. And unless you buy peer-to-peer and you get cash, and I think cash is an important dimension of a free society, we're not going to have this cypherpunk dream live on. And I do understand your criticism, but at the same time, we have to deal with some facts about what happened in terms of how these actors caught up with how Bitcoin works. It was pretty obscure, it was hard to understand in the early days, but then not just third parties that build companies and do blockchain analysis, but also governments caught up with how it works. And I think at this point, it deserves at least a form of privacy. It's the only way in which it can work as cash. And I think this, I'm going to apologize for this, but it's the perfect transition into presenting my sponsored ad. It's for Wasabi Wallet, which is a Bitcoin wallet that enables you to have more privacy. What it does basically is to mix your coins with those of hundreds of other users around the internet. It's routed via Tor. It runs on your full node. If you don't have a full node, it makes you download blocks via Tor. And if you think that after you do these coin joins and you mix your coins with other people around the internet, you're not going to be able to spend them because exchanges are going to be suspicious about what you're doing, there's also a buy anything button that's integrated. And that's an interface with a website that's called Shop in Bit. You tell them what you want, they deliver it, you pay in Bitcoin. You can ask for a delivery in your storage box, your post office box at your office. It doesn't have to be your home. You don't have to do it under your real name. You just have to make a payment and have a valid address and pick it up. So check out Wasabi Wallet at wasabiwallet.io. It's a pretty good hope that Bitcoin can work as money, but it's just not good enough. I think we're going to need some confidentiality for this, as in being able to hide the amount that you're sending to someone.
All right. Well, so I don't think CBDCs and decentralized crypto coexist. I think what I'm probably not expressing enough is that I think we're seeing a controlled demolition, intentional controlled demolition of the fiat system, which is designed to push everyone onto CBDCs, which is why there's been a crackdown on exchanges. It's why there's been a crackdown on local Bitcoins. It's why Ian Freeman is in federal prison for 8 years for voluntarily selling Bitcoin to people. I think that this has been a 7-year concerted effort by the federal government to try to shut down all decentralized crypto while building the technology and the solution for CBDC. I'm suggesting, I mean, I ran for president, and I have this shirt. My campaign was bank run now, halt CBDC, stop World War III, and the Fed. But people need to exit using fiat and actually use crypto, gold, and silver in a parallel economy for day-to-day transactions to be able to be immune from the fiat system. I mean, this is going to require, because otherwise, I think the default is, I mean, we're seeing the collapse of the fiat system. The dollar went from being backed by gold to not being backed by gold in the early 70s to now, once COVID policies were put in place, banks are no longer required to even have 10% of customer deposits on reserves, which means that when you go to withdraw money from a bank, you're counting on the people that have borrowed money for commercial real estate, residential real estate, student loans, car loans, credit card debt. You're counting on them to repay the principal and interest, which they're not. We're starting to near default rates. And so they know this, to the point where the ECB has actually put out a thing where they're monitoring social media posts for people talking about bank runs. This is part of why, when I mentioned yesterday, RBC in Canada wouldn't allow this guy to take $3,000 out of the banks are already nervous about a coming bank run. But the truth is, a bank run and people exiting the system and getting ready and using this in a parallel economy is probably the only option that we have. Because, I mean, if you have, I mean, how many people have crypto that isn't KYC'd? I mean, realistically, it's not very many people. If you look at the whole history of Bitcoin and people losing coins and just kind of like, there aren't enough people that have un-KYC'd crypto that are even in a similar geographical area to be able to trade with one another. You're not going to be able to live and buy food and actually have the basics based on just trading with people that have un-KYC'd crypto right now. So I think on a more fundamental basis, we need to get mass numbers of people adopting the use of these alternatives, or we're going to get stuck with CBDCs. And I add gold and silver in there as well, because I'm not a maxi on, I'm a CBDC minimalist, and I'm maximally for whatever else works to stop CBDCs. So when I talk, don't take what I'm saying as I've picked one coin. I mean, I like BCH because of where we are at this moment in time, because of how far behind we are on CBDCs, and because of how badly even fiat payment systems have leapfrogged BTC. Because, I mean, again, if we take a step back, in 2012, when I used Bitcoin for the first time, not only did the light bulb go off that I was able to trade with somebody without a bank or a government in the middle, but it was actually faster and cheaper. It was an actual better product than anything that existed in the traditional financial space. So in 2012, Bitcoin had a lead, I would say, ideologically and technically, right? But by 2017 and by now, Zelle, Venmo, Apple Pay, Google Pay, soon X payments, basically the free market spoke, traditional finance came in and developed offerings that were better than Bitcoin. So it actually had a lead. It was actually a better and easier to use product at one point. And this whole hobbling and non-innovating thing has created a situation where we're now playing defense. So I would say this, in 2012, when I got Bitcoin, it's like, here's a chance to spread freedom around the globe. Here's a chance to allow everybody to be able to trade voluntarily anywhere in the world. Now, sitting here in 2024, because of all of the internal dynamics, if we don't get a critical mass adoption of peer-to-peer digital currency, we're all going to get stuck with a dystopian form of digital currency, which is CBDCs. So the actual entire context has shifted from spreading freedom to now stopping tyranny. And it would be weird that if all of this stuff that's happened within Bitcoin ended up actually creating the opposite of what it was intended to.
But there's a disconnect in what you're saying, because on one hand, you mention names of people who have been jailed for selling Bitcoin, and you mention situations which are rather conspirational about what happened with development, and imply that basically there were greater forces that did not want Bitcoin to be used as cash. And then you mentioned that we should be adopting Bitcoin as cash as fast as possible. And the question is, how are you going to do it? Because the on-ramps, the way in which you can buy Bitcoin today, even if you prefer BCH as opposed to BTC, it doesn't matter. You're going to go to some on-ramp, and that on-ramp can deny you the service and say, I'm not going to let you purchase this. And is there enough peer-to-peer liquidity if you want to go to some other form of exchange? Can you withdraw your cash so that you can exchange the cash for your Bitcoin? Can you do this on a large scale? And the answer is no. And I think that it was designed to be a niche product, and it's going to keep on being a niche product, because there's no way this can work. Even if Bitcoin technically scales, there's no way you can get millions of people in one day to onboard it.
Well, I don't think it was designed to be a niche product. I think that's what it's been hijacked, and that's what the new explanation is. I don't think it was designed to be a niche product. But when I go around and I do these workshops, so you're going to get KYC'd. I mean, I don't know, maybe you can use your Wasabi wallet or some services that can help on the privacy side. But people can still today. And by the way, this gets worse every day. So let me be very clear about this. What I'm suggesting is not a high probability. I'm suggesting to everybody that the default is complete and total digital tyranny. That is actually the default if we do nothing at this point in time. So let's start by saying that. There are 134 countries that are at various stages of researching, piloting, and rolling out CBDCs. There are now more CBDC accounts globally than crypto accounts. The US has done 3 CBDC accounts. I mean, you mentioned the ECB, they're everywhere. And it doesn't matter if they're BRICS nations, it doesn't matter if they're the West, everybody is at some level of CBDC. And in 2020, there were only 35 countries even researching CBDCs. So if I could say anything, it would be to roll back to what I was saying earlier. Crypto is so much about comparing projects within the crypto space. And at the same time, we need to look at what's gone on. And so in the time that we've had Bitcoin, now there are more CBDC accounts. Almost every country is exploring a CBDC. Fiat has invented all of this other stuff. And then the primary narrative of the leading thing in crypto has been, well, it was always supposed to be digital gold, and it's only supposed to be 7 transactions per second. So the default is we're going to get digital tyranny. Every day that goes by, the opportunity to stop digital tyranny lessens significantly. So I wrote this book, I published it. I wrote my book, The Final Countdown, in June of last year. People can still, you don't have to take cash out of the bank. I actually mentioned the concept of bank run. You don't actually have to take the cash out to buy crypto. You can go to an exchange. You can use other services. You can, There are some things that you can do that are not KYC. There are some things that you can do in smaller transaction volumes that you can do on a day-to-day basis. There are ways people can start getting into using peer-to-peer digital cash. What I'm trying to do is just get people started, just get people their first self-custody crypto wallet, just get them. And again, I mentioned gold and silver as well. Look, when it comes to medium of exchange, BTC has actually been outperformed, you can't see this, by gold. So I'm holding in my hand a gold back. Okay, this is, you can't see it very well. This is a,
Keep it close to your face.
all right, here we go. This is a gold back. This is 1/1000th of an ounce of physical gold. So I can actually use this to buy and sell things. And in fact, in New Hampshire, I mean, I've never bought a gold back. I've sold books and I've sold things and received gold backs. There are gold back ATMs being installed across the United States. So physical gold actually has a medium of exchange that is superior to BTC for domestic payments, right? This doesn't solve a cross-border issue, but even gold is caught up. And I have, as part of the workshop that I do, I give people a 1/5 of an ounce of silver. So I'm saying to people, yeah, use gold and silver and crypto. When I say crypto, yeah, this has been the toughest part for me. This is how I've the current financial system, if you look at like Visa and MasterCard or whatever, can do, I think at peak about 50,000 transactions per second. That's not the average. I think on average, it's like 2,000 transactions per second. Just the US CBDC alone can do 1.8 million transactions per second. Obviously, the L1 Bitcoin can do 7 transactions per second. So in my book, again, I'm not a maxi. What I said in my book, at least when I originally published it, was I gave a list of cryptos that you should consider. And I took out things that are proof of stake and things that did an ICO, things that are centralized that could be easily shut down by the government or that are more likely to be cut off from exchanges first. Not that they're necessarily bad technology, but at this point in time, we're like, okay, we're late in the game. What are some credible options that are likely to be the most resilient? So I've kind of looked at, Bitcoin. I originally had BTC, BCH, BSV, Litecoin, Ravencoin, Monero, and Zcash. And I've got a table that shows the transactions per second for each of those coins, showing how combined, if people moved to these solutions and started using them, we could actually compete with the existing system. Unfortunately, I now have to take BSV off of that list. And BTC is a challenge because even since I wrote the book, and again, I'm not hostile to BTC to be hostile to BTC. I use BTC. I've accept, I'm not picking a side to pick a side. The issue with it is every time I try to use it or every time I try to onboard somebody with it, it becomes clear that it's not reliable peer-to-peer cash that can be used for day-to-day transactions. I mean, if you want to talk about mass adoption, good luck getting a boomer to set up a Lightning node. I mean, I understand why people think it's a great idea, but it's cash. What we need to do is have something that is equal to or better than the existing system, not something that is 10 times more complicated. So those are the coins that I've listed. And so I was kind of like, well, all right, now it's BCH, which is increasing the block size, Monero, Litecoin, Ravencoin. I'm certainly there are others, and I'm not saying that people are gonna be like, oh, well, you didn't mention my coin. Look, if you're using anything that is not fiat, and you're able to use it peer-to-peer, use it, that's great. I'm trying to instruct people on what they can do now. And for right now, you still can set up an exchange account. You still can acquire these cryptos, and you can start using them for day-to-day transactions. But I also have gold and silver as well, because really this is what we're up against. But the race against time, what I've said is I think there's a reasonable chance they'll implement CBDC in the United States before the 2024 election. One of the things that happened when I ran, I was just trying to get into the debates. Like I never had any expectation that I was going to win, but there was specifically, if I was able to get a certain amount of polling and a certain number of donors, then that would have given me access to the debate stage. So that was the sole reason that I ran, was to try to get this message in front of a large number of people. It turns out I probably could have gotten the number of donors. I couldn't get the polling companies to even consider including me in the polls. So that was actually the limiting factor. But with that said, I've spoke to many other presidential candidates. In fact, 4 of the libertarian candidates have signed an anti-CBDC pledge that I put together. I talked to Vivek Ramaswamy, who has read my book, and actually he talked to Trump, and Trump came out and said he was against CBDCs. Now, do I believe that? No. I mean, would I count on any political promise? No, I absolutely would not count on that. But part of the process as well is I spoke to Ted Cruz and a bunch of other people in Congress, including some of the ones that are supposedly pro-crypto. And there are not votes in the United States Congress to block a CBDC. They just aren't there. And they're going to use money laundering and terrorism as the justification to bring it in an emergency, just like we've seen with the Patriot Act and TARP and the CARES Act. So there's not much blocking a CBDC politically, and it's already been put in place technically. So if anything, I'm just trying to alert, because most people are not aware of what I've just said. None of what I've said is in the mainstream media. The fact that Project Hamilton exists and that they've created a CBDC and they've tested it is not something that people are aware of. Even if there's been an article or two about it, I can tell you, having given enough talks, that nobody has heard of it. 99% of Americans have not heard of any of the stuff that I'm talking about. And I think most people, even within the crypto community, aren't aware of exactly how serious this is. So my point is, we don't have a lot of time. One possible alternative is to get as many people into peer-to-peer crypto, whichever one you want to use, but I give some recommendations as possible, and to start using it for daily transactions. But like the idea that, I don't think Bitcoin is not going to back a CBDC. Central banks are not going to move towards sound money. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. And by the way, I will say also, it's very clear to me that the Bitcoin ETFs are about backdoor confiscation, because this executive order 14067 that Biden signed on March the 9th, 2022, did 2 things. It authorized the exploration of a US CBDC, and it authorized a whole of government approach to the regulation of digital assets. And when they say whole of government approach, that means not just the SEC. You have the SEC, you have the Department of Defense, you have the FBI, you have, because if you're looking at how the crackdown is happening, it's happening on multiple different levels. There were actually 5 different departments of the federal government involved in the Ian Freeman case, as one example. So they are clearly cracking down on this. So why would they allow, after like 12 years or 10 years or whatever of not allowing a Bitcoin ETF, why all of a sudden did they allow an ETF, right? So because we know they want to see, the government's stated position is to regulate digital assets and to promote a CBDC. It would not have been hard to deny a Bitcoin ETF. 90% of the ETFs combined hold the Bitcoin at Coinbase. Coinbase is currently being sued by the SEC. It would have been very easy to deny a Bitcoin ETF on the basis of the fact that there is not a legitimate third-party trusted custodian that could be relied upon to store and hold and maintain those assets. It would have been very easy for them to deny it. Now, if you look at what happened in 1933 with gold, so FDR passed an executive order and confiscated gold. And it turns out that if your gold was held in a third-party vault, if your gold was in a bank safety deposit box, they just took the gold. Like that. So if you had it in a centralized place, that was gone. Turns out 25% of the people did not turn in their gold. So if you were an individual and you had gold at home, legally you were obligated. You were supposed to, by law, turn in all of your gold for $35 an ounce, but people didn't. And about 25% of the supply of gold remained in people's hands. If you look at what's going on with these ETFs, it would be so easy for the ETF, for the Bitcoin ETF to be confiscated, to the point where I believe it's even mentioned in the risk factors section of these ETFs. Nobody reads those, and I highly recommend you dig into, if you're investing in an ETF, take a look at the terms and conditions and the risk factors, because confiscation is in fact one of them. So So right now we've got this digital gold narrative that people are pushing with a lot with the Bitcoin standard and with Michael Saylor and everything else. But really the price action, which is what drives whether or not it's a store of value, is largely now coming from these ETFs that are probably at the end of the day making it very easy for Bitcoin to be confiscated. So I mean, look, if you want to buy Bitcoin, that's fine. If you believe that it's a store of value, that's fine. Do not buy a Bitcoin ETF. I think I could say that with absolute certainty. There is no upside to buying Bitcoin through an ETF. You don't get access to it, you can't use it, and there are any of a number of different ways that it can be confiscated from you. So, sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but
I think you helped me a lot with presenting the next ad, which is for Huddling. Huddling is a business from Switzerland that helps you self-custody your funds. If you have a lot of Bitcoin, or you're a member or a board member in a company that stores Bitcoin, and you need help with setting up multi-signature setups or choosing hardware wallets or any sort of consultancy, Huddling is a company from Switzerland, and they benefit from that privacy that is exclusive to Swiss companies. So you can go to them, you can ask them for help. They're going to provide you all the solutions that you need to set up everything in a way that is going to still be there when you need it. And you're not going to get rugged. You're not going to have to go to Coinbase to custody for you. You're not going to have to hand some keys to a company like Casa. You just do everything by the book as presented to you by specialists. I I know one of the guys who's doing this. His name is Alexander Polto, and he's a nerd. I actually visited his apartment in Switzerland, and he has all sorts of hardware wallets that he keeps all around the place, and he plays with them, tries to hack them. A true nerd, and I would very much trust him if I had a lot of Bitcoin, which I don't. I would very much trust him with advice on how to make it harder to seize, harder to steal, harder to confiscate, because I guess the more rich you are, the bigger the target is on your back. So check out hodling.ch because they're a truly great service and they promote this idea of self-custody. And I understand why you like this dimension of politics. I can listen to you talk all day and probably agree with about 90% of what you're saying, Yaron. But at the same time, you have to be aware that there are some dynamics at play right here. We are in an era where there is blockchain analysis, and the on-ramps and the off-ramps are controlled. They're regulated, they're KYC'd. It's very hard to get into the system, especially if it has an open ledger. I think that Monero and Zcash are in a much more privileged position in this regard, but I think for the reason that they offer privacy, they didn't get much action on markets. And it's very hard to present Bitcoin as this electronic cash that's against the government when the government knows everything that you do. And if it scales, once again, I'm repeating this argument, if it scales on chain, which I think is a terrible idea in the long run, because every transaction is going to be stored forever in there. And even if you do make your payments private, at one point you might leak an address or an XPub from your wallet to someone, and that's going to go to the government, and they're going to be able suddenly to trace back everything you've ever done from that wallet. I think it's a very bad design. I see why it was working in the early days, because there was no such thing as blockchain analysis and that was taboo. But today I wouldn't want to participate in a system that can basically enslave you and can, I mean, there's no privacy really in Bitcoin. You can do some tricks. You can mix your coins with other users and have amounts that create deniability, but there is no way for you to actually make a private transaction with Bitcoin. You can do it with second layers. I think Lightning has better privacy. I think if they get through drive chains, they're going to have that Zcash sidechain, which is going to have privacy by default. And that's basically a fungibility pool where you can put your Bitcoin and make private transactions. But these are just proposals to improve Bitcoin. So far, from what I've seen, and this also applies to Bitcoin Cash, there is no proper confidentiality. So why would you want to have your transactions written there forever and available to the entire network, the entire participants of present and future who are going to be syncing nodes, so they can be nosy and figure out what you've done in the past. To me, it seems like a bad idea.
Well, again, I'm saying right now we need to stop fiat or it will turn into CBDC. So what I'm suggesting is if we don't get a mass movement of people to stop fiat, we actually have to halt the existing system. The only way to stop this is to actually stop fiat, because I don't care if you have a privacy coin or not. In fact, I spoke with one of the devs who's worked on 2 of the US CBDC pilots, and he told me that what's coming next is they're going to ramp up AML to the next level where you have to register all of your digital assets. So how many people realistically, when presented with the risk of going to jail, like, we're not going to be able to run a parallel economy if you're not going to get a mass number of people to not comply with this stuff, right? So, I mean, so then there are going to be like 1,000 people left that have privacy-based cryptocurrency. Where are they going to trade? Who are they going to trade with? My point behind this is we have to stop the existing system. So even if it's on a ledger, if people are actually using something and you've halted the fiat system, then you actually stop the government from actually having, you're basically shutting the government down by defunding the government, by exiting fiat. That's the only, I guess what I'm saying, to be more clear, is the only way to stop this is to essentially defund the government by getting out of fiat. And if you've done that, it doesn't matter if the transactions are on the ledger or not. You've actually, the government is essentially put to a halt with respect to where fiat currency is. Because otherwise, you're right about everything that you've said. I mean, now it's KYC. Like, this is the problem with the complacency and the slowness with everything that's gone on with crypto. It's been this lackadaisical, we'll work on this, maybe we'll add a side chain here. It's like, okay, by the time BTC has a side chain that does this, you know what, 90 countries are going to have a CBDC implemented like that. Like, there's no, we're competing against people that have the force of the state behind us and have an incumbent position of having a monopoly on the financial system. So we need to be innovating faster than they're innovating. And just simply from the fact that people used to be able to use crypto for payments and now they can't, and we've actually gone backwards, like, we don't have whatever amount of time there might be now, starting in 2024, 15 years later, to develop a new solution. We need to get people off of fiat as quickly as possible. And I'm not saying that this is a high probability of success. What I'm saying is this: the people that I'm talking to are not part of the crypto community. What's happened is there's been an awakening since 2020 because of COVID tyranny. There is an awakening on 2 dimensions. One, people did not like the lockdowns. They did not like the mandates. They didn't like the vaccines, especially since kind of the aftermath of all of that. And they didn't like the effects of the money printing because it's impacted everybody personally. And so you have people that 7 years ago, 10 years ago, where, you know, if we were at a libertarian conference and Roger Ver came up and said, hey, this is a way to, you know, transact without central banks, no one would have cared about that as a feature. Today, there are tens of millions of people that have woken up that don't know anything about the history of this, but that are looking for solutions. And I will say there's also a component to this. There's a huge component of religious people that view CBDCs as being like the mark of the beast. There's a biblical component to this. There is a distrust of CBDCs that it's millions of people. It shocked me when I was traveling through the Midwest and the South, how many people came up to me, and that was their number one concern. I mean, they're like viewing this as a moral, this is a fundamental good versus evil type of situation. Like, where are they going to be when the rapture happens, kind of thing. Like, so that's a huge block of people. That was not a block of people in 2012. That wasn't a big block of people in 2017. So what I'm saying is, this whole new audience of people can be onboarded to crypto. And I'm not saying that we have great solutions. I'm saying that there's a handful of, I take your point on proof of work. There are things you can do to add your privacy, but we need to get enough people using this in a parallel economy. You need to be able to go to a farm locally. You need to be able to buy food. You need to be able to exist outside of the existing system, or it isn't useful at all. And I mean, looking at the COVID tyranny, how many people didn't want to take a vaccine? Or how many people did things that they didn't want to do for fear of losing their job? Well, once governments have control over money and can basically censor all of your activities with the click of a button, how many people are going to comply? How many people are actually going to stand up? So I get that it's not perfect, and this is why I say there's a handful. Monero is great because it can do a lot of transactions per second. So I'm saying whatever combination, um, I say if it's proof of stake or it's something that did an ICO, it's probably more likely to get shut down first. But you've got to balance what can you even get on an exchange. So I think of it this way. My target audience, the target market to me should be like boomers that have minimal technical background, right? So these people have 43% of the wealth of the country. If the solution can't be something that they can adopt, then we're going to fail to be able to develop parallel economies. And if we fail to develop parallel economies, then the fiat system by default will be pushed into CBDC, and that will likely happen in an emergency.
I tried to not put it this way, but I'm gonna be more direct with my question. What if something like Bitcoin Cash does become the CBDC and the government? So let me explain it this way. When you make a purchase from your bank account, your government only knows about it if they request information from the bank. Maybe they don't care, they're not gonna request it. But if you do make a purchase from your wallet, be it Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, Dash, whatever is transparent and has an open ledger, the government knows because they collect that information. They make sure that they know who the users are, and it's an open ledger. Anyone with an internet connection can see the existing transactions. And if they have the information about the onboarding and when people bought from exchanges and what they did afterwards, it's just a matter of matching transactions, matching entries in the ledger. So what if Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, or whatever becomes the CBDC and we are just promoting or accelerating the inevitable?
Well, I don't think it's accelerating the inevitable. I think that the default is clearly CBDCs. So based on the roadmap, based on, again, the technology has been developed, the executive order is already in place. This is actually the default. So we're actually in a defensive posture. So what we should, the way we need to be looking at this is the default. How do we stop the default? What you've raised is it's a valid question, and I struggle with it in part because I looked at BSV for a while, because BSV, when I compared, well, what would we need to be able to onboard people to be able to compete with Visa and MasterCard? And BSV looked interesting. And then as I dug into it, and then I dug into the censoring of transactions, and then I talked to Craig Wright, and then I actually tried to speak at the London blockchain conference on this. I actually spoke with people over there. I'm like, guys, you guys are sitting here thinking people are going to adopt this. This could be a way to avoid CBDCs. And so that community is actually, they want that. They somehow think this is a good thing or an inevitable thing. It is conceivable that could happen. But when you look at, there are 134 countries and they are actively working on CBDCs. None of them are looking at permissionless blockchains. None of them are looking at BSV. None of them are looking at BCH. None of them are looking at BTC. They're all using permissioned solutions already. The US has built its own CBDC. So it's not BCH. They've actually built their own proprietary system because they want a permissioned system, not a permissionless system. But I agree with you that it's not great that it's an open ledger. And my understanding is there are some things that you can do to make your transactions more private, but are most people going to do that, right? So let's go back to the standard. I'm onboarding there's a boomer that has a high net worth that is sick of the tyranny and doesn't want the mark of the beast. How many, they're not going to run a node. They're not going to go through and do like the actual product has to be dead simple. It has to be as simple as the existing systems. So What I'm saying is it's a race against time. The default is that we lose. Can we get enough other people using, even if it's an open ledger, can we get enough people using something so that it actually makes a dent into fiat? Like if we don't get enough people doing this, then again, by default, fiat will become CBDC. So this is about numbers. This is about getting a large number of people. Right now, I think crypto is a hobby. I mean, I know all the people that have crypto and the people that use crypto. And if all of a sudden everything was shut down, that doesn't help me buy groceries. That doesn't help me at all on a day-to-day basis. That is not going to help me, live on a day-to-day basis. So unless this becomes mainstream fast, and I don't know how to make it mainstream fast without we have to use what we have, right? So again, we're in an imperfect situation. We are now behind. We're on defense. So we have to use what we have. What is available today, if they might implement a CBDC before the end of the year, can we use to get enough people engaged in a parallel economy to not get stuck with CBDC? I wish we had a different ideal solution, but we're not in an ideal solution. We're 15 years in and we now have almost no P2P adoption, and we're all facing CBDCs. That's the reality of where we are. And that
Well,
will affect
when you
everything.
say we, it's generally the United States, because the previous interview was with Ray Youssef, who is working with the global south, that's what he calls it, with Latin America and Africa, and he has millions of users who onboarded his P2P platform, and there are a bunch of traders who sell and buy Bitcoin for a living. So they do this to make money, and it's super profitable. And for these people, specifically because they live within a tyrannical system, it's easy for them to find alternatives. But in the US, I think decades of indoctrination about being the greatest nation on the planet, and I guess trust in the dollar, because it has been the dominant currency for so long, I think it's gonna take longer for parallel economies to develop with any sort of other currency other than the dollar. Even in the event that a CBDC happen, I see a lot of people just shifting and migrating towards it just because they understand that they have this power that the rest of the world does not have to hold the currency that is used as reserve by other countries.
Well, I mean, but it's not just it's 134 countries that are pursuing CBDCs, and I'm not saying that it's great in the U.S. I'm not saying this is high probability. If you look at the COVID tyranny and what people were willing to put up with, the odds are here are not great. My whole point is to try to raise awareness to this issue because most people have no idea what we're talking about right now. Again, the overwhelming majority of people have not heard any of what we've discussed on this interview. But when you want to talk about, and I love what Ray's doing, but look at these CBDCs are being rolled out globally, and there is a control element to this. If you look at what happened in Nigeria, because I've talked to people in Nigeria, and they're like, where their CBDC has failed, but they're still bringing it back, right? The CBDC is not done. It had a rough start, but they haven't given up on it. And I talked to people in Nigeria, like, why did we even implement this? Well, they implemented it because the IMF and the World Bank pushed it. Nobody in Nigeria internally decided to push a CBDC. So in developing countries, you are seeing the UN, the IMF, and the World Bank push CBDCs on other countries as well. And so maybe these countries will last or will be able to develop parallel economies better than others, but this stuff is all coming from the top down, whether you are in a developed nation or a developing nation.
Yeah, I agree it's pretty hard. Regardless of what you're trying to do, what you're trying to promote, it's hard. And as you said, the scalability is limited. Of course, the government can have millions of transactions per second in this centralized system where they use high bandwidth internet with supercomputers and they can do whatever they want. But if you're thinking of a decentralized system, you need the average person to be able to spin up a node in their bedroom. And that's a bottleneck. The technology that the average person can afford and can use in order to maintain the decentralization of a network, that's important.
I don't think everybody has to. I don't buy into the everybody has to run a node, and that the whole limiting
There's a
factor of
difference
this.
between has to and can. There is an optionality. If you want, you should be able to participate.
But again, the cost of that is then you don't actually have peer-to-peer digital cash.
Well, you can have it within reasonable limits. I mean, Bitcoin Cash right now doesn't have gigabyte blocks. They have a reasonable, I think it's 20 something megabytes.
It's
It's a
30,
limit.
it's 32, but there's no reason if you look at how hard drive technology has progressed since 2009. The idea when you read the Bitcoin standard, I mean, he's talking about the fact that it's like, if you're going to process Visa and MasterCard levels, you'd have to have 42 terabytes of storage or something like that. And it's like, okay, that's not that expensive. Like, so to hold that as the reason to not expand or scale the system. Like the whole thing is based on, honestly, that to me, the whole view around nodes and decentralization and cost of technology reminds me of the same argument that the UN and the technocrats are making. They're trying to design an entire system based on their perception of scarcity. Their view is we know what's best. We know about the planet and about carbon production. And so they're taking their view and their understanding of the world and stating that their scarcity mindset is all that there is, and they're trying to protect everyone by creating systems that work within the framework of their manufactured scarcity. And the reality is, there's what we know, there's what we know we don't know, and then there's what we don't know we don't know, and it's the what we don't know where all the magic is. It's almost infinite in comparison to the other two slices of the pie. And so it's like the idea that we should limit things because people decided that they thought that, well, people will only be able to run nodes based on 2009 technology, assumes that there's not going to be innovation and a reduction in cost of hard drive space and memory and bandwidth. And in fact, if you look at the curve since 2009, it's absolutely true. I ran a comparison. It costs $300 to have a 2 terabyte hard drive in 2009, and now I can buy a micro SD card at Walmart that's 2 terabytes for $14.98. I just saw that somebody released there was a like 300 terabytes per second bandwidth pilot that's going on. But even if you look at global bandwidth, the cost and the speed is phenomenal. And now on top of that, if you typically were talking about Moore's law or something like this, now we have the application of AI to engineering systems and to chip design. So my belief is, and even though I can't explain how we're going to do it, if left up to the free market, we'll probably outpace Moore's law. Things will become even cheaper and even faster and globally available. But we've held to this system that it's got to be based on what was affordable based on technology in 2009, based on an arbitrary block size. And to me, it's scarcity based, and it's indistinguishable to me from the technocratic version that the UN is putting out.
Well, your argument once again is political, but you have to think of the average African citizen. If they do want to validate their own transactions, they're gonna have to spin up a node. And I have to ask you, how long does it take you to validate from Genesis block on BTC and BCH with the hardware
I,
that you have?
I don't, that's not even an important thing for me to do. Like, I don't actually subscribe to that as even being important. I actually think that, I think it was designed to be SPV for normal payments. And I think that miners, it was designed for miners to be the ones adding things to the block. To me, this whole idea, like what has been how many nodes, how many of these Raspberry Pi nodes have detected dishonest behavior on the part of mining nodes and corrected and done something about it? Like what has been the upshot of this? What has been the actual practical use? I understand, to me, it's political to say everybody should be running their own node. What's been the practical usefulness of everybody being able to run their own node? How has it made the network better?
So your transactions are much more private if you do run your own node, because you don't delegate storing the XPub to some neutrino, not neutrino, to some Electrum server that's running somewhere in the cloud. You don't know who's going to store information about your transactions. If you do run your own node, you're going to have your XPub, which is the extended public key, stored locally. which means that when you interact with other actors, you only broadcast the transaction yourself to the mempool that you store yourself and hope and wait for the miners to pick it up. You're not delegating this task. So it has to do with your own privacy.
But I understand the concept behind it, but there's going to be privacy for transactions that don't exist, because by limiting it based on 15-year-old technology, nobody will be engaging in transactions. So yeah, great. I'll have a node and I'll be able to publish my own transactions and remain private for no transactions, because no one's actually using it for peer-to-peer. I mean, there are
Well,
market-based
that's a big
solutions.
statement.
It
A
can be
lot of
more than
people use
just
it, but they pay
electric.
the fee.
Well, it's not peer-to-peer digital cash. It's not competing with fiat, and it certainly isn't a substitute for CBDC.
Can I
I
send
mean,
you Bitcoin right now in a peer-to-peer way?
can you send me BTC in a peer-to-peer way? Well, if you're going to send me BTC, I'm using a wallet.
No, it's a question of possibility. Can I do it?
You can do it, yes. And when
What prevents me
we
from doing it?
fees are what prevent it from being useful as an alternative. And the minute, as we get closer and closer to CBDCs, the more people that go to use Bitcoin, the more expensive it's going to be. And it's going to be just like December 2017 all over again. And we know this because we saw this with ordinals. People started putting NFTs on BTC. And what happened? Yes, the transaction fees went up, and it also affected Lightning because of the way Lightning works. Lightning can only onboard so many people based on the constraints of the block size and everything else. And so if you're in a panic situation, or if you're in a situation where you're onboarding a lot of people, BTC is already expensive today. It's already not competitive with fiat today. And as more demand is put on the system, it becomes worse to use, it becomes more expensive, and it becomes more time consuming. So you and I can send it, or we could even do a Lightning transaction, but the 99.99% of people in the world that would want to get onboarded with this are going to have to deal with the BTC base layer. They're going to have to deal with a lot of complexity. They're going to have to deal with a lot of cost, and it's going to take time. Again, we have to have a competitive offering, not a worse offering. And the offering for BTC has gotten worse. It's more expensive for me to send you BTC today, or for you to send me BTC today, is more expensive than it was 10 years ago, 11 years ago when I first used BTC. And that is
But the price
not,
also went up a lot since then.
well, the price went up a lot, but it's still from the standpoint of, then it's only usable for people that got in and held for a long period of time. That doesn't help anybody today. That helps however many people bought in early, but a currency that's based on, that benefits people that bought in a decade ago, isn't going to be how we onboard people to have a parallel economy that competes with CBDCs. That's just going to be something that, a few thousand people benefited from that got in early.
Let me ask you this. What is the value proposition of Bitcoin? Why is it so great? What makes it different from Visa or MasterCard?
Wow, that's an interesting question. Which version of Bitcoin? If I would say the Bitcoin white paper, the benefit of it is that it's peer-to-peer cash that can be used without third parties and without intermediaries. And where there's a fixed supply is a benefit to it as well. To me, the initial benefit of Bitcoin, which was launched after the 2008 financial crisis, was as an alternative, a potential form of sound money that could be used by anyone anywhere in the world, that's fast and cheap and doesn't have third parties or governments inflating the supply. That's what the idea of it was. That's not necessarily what the reality of it is today. The reality of BTC today is it's a speculative investment that you can make money on until the party's over. That's what BTC is right now, to me. And, so BCH, Monero, and a few others, like I said, the handful of others are potentials that can be used in a parallel economy as an alternative to CBDCs, but understanding that time is running out, and each day that people aren't adopting, the entire space becomes less and less valuable and less likely to stop tyranny.
Okay, but how would you comment on the fact that Bitcoin, as opposed to anything else which revolves around governments and private banks, is censorship resistant and cannot be confiscated? Is this valuable?
Um, I guess ask Ross Ulbricht if it can be confiscated. Ask Ian Freeman if it can be confiscated. Um, what does it mean that it can't be confiscated? I know a lot of people that have had Bitcoin confiscated by court orders and or thrown in jail if they did not comply. So, so who, I don't know to what extent that even stands up. I guess it's technically possible that, uh, how many people actually even have BTC that's not KYC'd? So I know what you're saying about the argument that it's censorship. Is it censorship resistant? Like, I don't know. I don't know how many people that even applies to at this point in time, based on kind of the history of it, who owns it now, and the trading back and forth. I mean, how many people were careful about, you kept on mentioning the idea that people can do chain analysis, but early on that wasn't known. In fact, Russ Ulbricht, there was, I know in the Liberty community early on, there wasn't necessarily an appreciation for the fact that it was pseudonymous instead of anonymous. And I think there were a lot of people that thought it was truly encrypted, and they engaged in commerce accordingly. And then it turns out that that wasn't the case. And a lot of people are in jail and have suffered consequences for that. So how many people have been aware of the chain analysis and everything else from the very beginning that actually hold this stuff that couldn't be tracked? And then if it could be tracked, if presented with a court order or threatening jail time, what would their reaction to that be? What would be the value of that censorship resistance be? I mean, I'm looking today, but Craig Wright, it's been interesting to watch, because he was trying to make this argument, which was kind of hilarious, that, he was trying to force courts to force devs to basically move coins. This was part of his whole lawsuit against the core devs. And I think Roger was in that lawsuit and everything else. It was like $100 billion lawsuit. And his argument was, which is an interesting argument. I think it's good that he's not Satoshi, by the way, because there's a big belief. People like to have this belief that because it's an open source project, you can't sue anybody, and that there's no legal liability. And that's not actually how the law works. And I'm very familiar with this specifically. I ended up as a co-defendant in $280 million worth of litigation for personal liability. Whereas if I had a corporation, that would be one thing. But the fact that we didn't have a corporation meant I had as much liability as the other person. And in fact, that's what Craig was suing the devs for. The idea was that the devs, were responsible for the network, and if he could prove that his coins were stolen, then all of those defendants would have personal liability to either move his coins or to make up the financial difference. And that, fortunately, Craig made up either the fact that he was Satoshi or that he even held the coins. But had that not been the case, that legal precedent would have gone another way. And so what would have practically been the benefit to what would have happened to the devs? What happens to people when they get sued that have Bitcoin? Again, I know people that are in jail. So how many people out there are benefiting from this censorship resistant money that hasn't been KYC'd? I don't think it's many, and it certainly isn't a movement that is going to stop the implementation of CBDCs. And if they do decide, which I think they are going to do, to just ban Bitcoin outright, because look, you're already seeing this. Like, if people will say, "Oh, they're not going to ban it," and it's like and I know people like to hold on to, and I like to hold it. Like, again, it was magical for me the first time I got a Bitcoin. I'm like, wow, this is awesome, because I've had startups and I've had to deal with merchant credit card processing and holdbacks, and my second company was destroyed in part because I had an incentive-based model, and the bank that we had debit cards we were using for debit cards, had to cancel the ability to use debit cards because of Dodd-Frank. I was using checks as another payment option, and literally I was using a vendor that had been in business for 30 years. And because one of their other customers was allegedly involved in offshore gambling, all of the customers' funds, including mine, were seized by the Department of Justice. And I had to go back and prove that these were my funds to get the funds back. So I've seen how the fiat system works. I've actually had a business destroyed in part because of fiat and because unrelated to my business. None of the stuff that destroyed my business was because of me. I wasn't targeted. I was collateral damage from other government regulation that was targeting other players. So at the end of the day, I'm going back to, unless we get a mass number of people to be able to use this in a parallel economy, the small number of people that may have this stuff, that maybe have it in a privacy controlled environment or whatever, will have nobody to trade with because everybody else is going to comply. And I think most of the people that I know that are engaged in privacy code, they're all spread out. They're not even in a similar geographical region. So like, what use is it going to be for me to have Monero if I need to buy something physical or I need food or I need some basic, and the person closest to me that has a privacy coin is 200 miles away. I don't know, that probably didn't answer your question, but
You asked me a question about censorship resistance, and I think you're conflating two terms, which is confiscation resistance and censorship resistance. Confiscation resistance means that when someone comes to you to seize your Bitcoin, you're gonna be able to not hand it to them due to plausible deniability or some technique that makes it impossible even for yourself physically to retrieve your Bitcoin, and increases the difficulty for someone else, an attacker, be it private or governmental. But censorship resistance has to do with the fact that you broadcast a transaction and someone's gonna pick it up and put it inside of a block. So the incentive for censorship resistance to exist in the first place is that there is a transaction fee that the miner is going to receive in exchange for adding your transaction into a block. Maybe that you are someone from Iran, my girlfriend is from Iran, and you want to send a transaction and you are on some sort of blacklist made by the OFAC. Maybe that's the case. Maybe that 90% of the miners are compliant with that OFAC blacklist. But there is that other 10% that's going to mine blocks, and you paid the right fee for that transaction to get included into a block, and the miner is going to accept your transaction to include it. So that's what censorship resistance is about. And without the fee to bribe the miner, there is no way for Bitcoin to be censorship resistant.
But again, if CBDCs are implemented and the crackdown continues to take place, there's not going to be a network or a market or usefulness for people to use this anyway. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying this is kind of a all or nothing situation. And by the way, under that situation, I mean, why not just use, gold backs or silver? I mean, at some point, the crackdown is, I guess I'm trying to figure out how to express this. The rate at which Bitcoin and crypto has been cracked down upon, and the rate at which CBDCs are being rolled out, is making the use cases so small that unless we actually make this stuff useful at scale, like it's going to be like a micro niche. Like, I'm not even sure how useful it would be for somebody in Iran if everyone's blocked it and now no one uses it as currency. Like, what use is it going to be for them at that point in time? I understand that it's censorship resistant, but unless there's utility at scale, I don't think it's going to be very useful for anybody. And I don't think it was intended to be a niche. I don't think this was ever intended to be a niche product. There's nothing that I've read about in the white paper, Bitcoin Talk, or anything else that said this was supposed to be a niche product. And by the way, I think there are reasons why Bitcoin was rolled out the way that it was, as opposed to maybe a more privacy enabled version of it, because I mean, we had Liberty Dollar and there were other cryptocurrencies that have been launched where the people that launched those are in prison. There's actually there's legal components to this. I think Satoshi is anonymous not because it was designed to be a gift to the world where people wouldn't know who Satoshi was. I think that there's an understanding of Satoshi was the initial issuer, and based on the legal precedent of what has happened to other people that have created cryptocurrencies in the past, it was highly beneficial for whoever Satoshi Nakamoto was to remain anonymous for that reason.
I'm not denying this. What I'm saying is that censorship resistant is important, and it's something that makes Bitcoin stand apart from all the fiat currencies and all the banking services and all the other ways to transact. The fact that you can make a transaction that's going to get validated by the network by virtue of providing the proper incentives for it to be included in a block is something that you don't have. If you're making a banking transaction, you're making a wire transfer, you're gonna get denied on the basis of the recipient that is not nice enough, or maybe you're not a nice person and you're trying to make a transaction and nobody wants to allow you to do it. But there's a lot of value in this dimension of Bitcoin, that one transaction is censorship resistant by virtue of decentralization. There is always someone on the other side of the world mining transactions and accepting basically any transaction, not caring about what the government says. And for as long as there is at least one free nation in this world and that nation allows people to mine, Bitcoin can remain decentralized. And this is the statement that I'm trying to make in conjunction with what you're saying. I'm not sure if you put together all of the cryptocurrencies that you recommend, that there's enough scalability to onboard the totality of population of the United States in the event of a catastrophic event. I'm aware that there are also some physical solutions. For example, I promote Dime, which is a way for you to put your Bitcoin on a card. It's a Java card, it's open source. You can even use NFC to tap it to scan to see if the balance is inside. And if you want to spend it, you're gonna have to unseal it, so it's gonna be visible. It's sort of like the Cassius coins, if you remember that from back in the day. And this can be used as a way to scale it if you really want to have a local way to exchange goods and services in exchange for Bitcoin. But I don't see it scaling at this point to enabling maybe 100 million people joining Bitcoin within 1 month. Not just Bitcoin, all the other cryptocurrencies. I don't think we have the capacity at this point. That's why I'm bullish on sidechains, because those can bring a lot of benefits with a currency that's less volatile. Because let's say that Raven coin or Litecoin or whatever has the capacity, but it doesn't have the same market stability and it doesn't have the same degree of adoption as Bitcoin. So to me, Bitcoin sidechains make a lot of sense for scalability, for onboarding a lot of people. Plus, if they have privacy, I think that's perfect, because you don't want to leave permanent traces about everything that you do.
But again, you still have to get onto Bitcoin. I mean, it's kind of like one of the reasons Lightning has failed. So it doesn't, you cannot onboard mass people onto Bitcoin or Bitcoin second layer solutions either. That's been demonstrated. And again, that was demonstrated with something as basic as ordinals NFTs. As to whether or not these other solutions, I mean, I put a table in there into what the combined transactions per second are. BCH in like 45 days or something like that is moving to a dynamic block size. Monero can already handle a couple of thousand transactions per second. So if you take those coins and combine them, they actually can get to what basically the average transaction per second threshold is for Visa and MasterCard today. And I put that out there. And actually, when I put the book out there, I originally had BSV out there because BSV could do 50,000 transactions per second. Unfortunately, BSV is what BSV is. But actually, BSV has demonstrated that you can do that kind of transaction volume on chain. Now, the reason that it's not decentralized is more of a function of who the people are and their use of lawfare than necessarily a technical argument. And so so big blocks can work, but they require people to adopt them, and they require the people that are actually rolling it out to not engage in hostile, aggressive behavior and leveraging the force of the state. But big blocks can work. I mean, I've used BSV. And when you talk about censorship resistance, I mean, censorship resistance, not only in terms of money, in terms of, because money is speech, but also in terms of actual information itself that can be put on the blockchain in big blocks. That has huge and tremendous potential. I mean, I used an application on BSV that's an alternative to Twitter. It's called Twetch. And basically, you're storing your tweets on the blockchain. So you're actually putting information in the blocks. Your information is going out and it is available on the blockchain. So there are applications. If you look at what you can do at scale with a censorship resistant blockchain, it's, yes, it can be an alternative to fiat. Yes, it can be, it can be digital gold, but it also can be enable microtransactions. It can enable all new business models and ways of conducting business. All of Silicon Valley is based on the allure of giving you free products and services, but where they're monetizing you and your data. And the ability to use microtransactions is something that completely changes and opens up a whole new world in terms of ownership of your own data and the potential for privacy and the potential for microtransactions. So there's actually a lot more potentially to Bitcoin than just, the narrow slices that it's been pushed off to. But for me now, and again, this might have been different at different points in time, I'm pushing, to me, CBDCs are the big threat, because if we don't stop CBDCs, then I think all of this is irrelevant. If we don't stop CBDCs, we're going to have complete control of our currency. We're going to have social credit systems. Literally, freedom is going to stop if these things are implemented, because it's going to allow and enable all of these other things. And if you want to know what that looks like, look at China. But China is not a one-off. This is essentially what's being developed in other countries. And I think you brought up a good point. I'm going to do an article on this as well. We largely already have a lot of various social credit systems. I mean, we have our credit score, and we have a number of other different things that are used to kind of measure behavior within the U.S. system. And I actually want to kind of lay out what those are, because you could connect those together and it wouldn't be very hard to implement a social credit system. So to me, if we don't stop this, I don't see any of the rest of this mattering. Like if you're interested in liberty at all, if you're interested in free will, it seems like stopping CBDC should actually be the number one focus, because you're basically going to lose your ability you're going to lose speech. You're going to lose the ability to protest on any issue if your money can be programmed, monitored, and censored.
I was checking the chat to see if we have any questions. It seems like people just added their personal comments. I was going to ask you, where can people find your book, and what do you think is the best short-term solution to stop, or not necessarily stop, but delay the adoption of CBDCs, which seems so imminent?
So the best thing, you can go to day2024.com. There's a link to the book. It's also on Amazon. So you can just go to Amazon and type, it's the full title is The Final Countdown, Crypto, Gold, Silver, and the People's Last Stand Against Tyranny by Central Bank Digital Currencies. So to me, the best solution that we have, and again, having run for president and been involved in political activism, is not politics. But we do not have a political solution for this. In 2022, 100% of incumbent U.S. senators won re-election. 94.5% of members of the House of Representatives won re-election. And now we have Trump versus Biden. So basically, it's going to be 97, 98% the same no matter what. And if you take a look at where these people are on these issues, I mean, they're already violating Fourth Amendment rights. There's no hope of a political solution. So the entirety of what I've been saying is, we need to get as many people as quickly as possible. Time is not on our side to get into self-custody crypto, gold and silver. So I'm leaving this wide open. So I'm not a maximalist, even with respect to what the form of alternative asset is that you use as an alternative to fiat, but to get as many people onboarded and to start using these alternatives for day-to-day transactions. So in other words, this isn't a discussion about this isn't about a hedge against inflation. This is about a hedge against complete and absolute digital tyranny. And I think the only thing that we can do is take control of our own money and start using it in a parallel economy to do day-to-day trade.
Yeah. I think the only point where we disagree is our coin of choice. And I'm still very hopeful that Bitcoin is going to get proper sidechains. I'm positive on BIP 300. You can onboard people directly onto it. You can have big block sidechains. The average node runner does not have to validate that. You can just leave this, you can delegate it to the miners. It's pretty cool. If you haven't already, check out BIP 300 by Paul Stortz. It's an interesting proposal. And you prefer Bitcoin Cash because it scales on chain. I think it's a bad design specifically because of the blockchain analysis that's out there and also the centralization concerns. But at the end of the day, we can agree that both of them are much better than using fiat. And it's better
Well, well, well,
to.
well, and to be clear, I'm Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, Monero, Zcash. Like the only concern that I have. So it's literally, I get it. Maybe BIP 300 happens, maybe not. But so I'm going to be in front of 300 people in 3 weeks, right? I cannot onboard them cost effectively now. If I'm gonna give them like $5 worth of cryptocurrency, doing that with BTC. So I've got an audience of boomers that have a reasonable net worth. Onboarding them with $5 of BTC is not practical today. So, but let me say this: if what you say is true, I'm a CBDC minimalist. I will switch, right? Like if if they increase the block size, if A, B, and C happens, I do it. But we're dealing with a finite period of time, right? We're not. I think the frustration that I have with BTC is there really has been, like, I don't know how many times I heard people say, well, lightning will happen when it happens, right? We were at a point in time in December of 2017 where people were using Bitcoin as money, and it was like getting mainstream adoption. And a decision was made to say, well, you know what? We don't care about that. We want fees to be high. We're going to develop new experimental technology, and literally said it will be done when it's done. And in the time that's happened, we've gotten Venmo, PayPal, Apple Pay, Google Pay, FedNow, and 134 countries developing CBDCs. So I guess let me say this. I mean, if you're a BTC maxi, then like get your ass in gear and get this shit launched, because we're actually competing in a global marketplace with central banks and traditional finance. And like the time is actually of the essence here. But if it works, I'll use it, right? I mean, I'll commit to you if this stuff works, I'm going to add it back into what I suggest. I'm trying to recommend to people whatever works. And right now, today, when I'm in front of a group of people, I can't recommend Bitcoin because of the cost and the speed.
Yeah, I get that. And I think it's better for them to experiment with something that they might lose at one point, you know? Maybe that they're not good at self-custodying and they're gonna be sloppy, lose their keys. It's not gonna be very tragic if they lose Ravencoin or whatever. But I do get your point. I congratulate you for your advocacy. And can you mention again where people can find your work and read your book, or maybe come to one of these meetings if they're boomers?
Sure, sure. You don't have to just be a boomer or anybody, but it's day2024.com, and that lists, you can link to the workshops. You can also link to my book. You can also see my articles. I'm a fellow at the Brownstone Institute, so I regularly write articles about various things related to CBDCs. And I also have a podcast, The Aaron Day Show, which is fairly new, but it's available YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, all of the usual places.
Thank you very much, Aaron, and I wish you